On the 2nd of March 1980, a Boeing B-29 Superfortress came down toward the runway at Duxford in England. It was not arriving from a military base after a routine assignment. It was not beginning a new flying career. This was supposed to be the last flight of its life. The Imperial War Museum wanted the bomber as a permanent static exhibit, an aircraft that could stand indoors and never need to fly again. Yet the solution chosen to get this particular B-29 from California to Britain was to make it airworthy, launch it from a desert weapons station where it had sat for 23 years, and fly it across a continent and the North Atlantic. Its serial number was 44-61748. By the time it reached Duxford, it carried the name It's Hog Wild. Months earlier, it had still been at China Lake in California, weathered by years outdoors and far removed from normal operational maintenance. The museum did not need a combat-ready bomber. It needed one safe enough to make one final journey. That distinction would define everything that followed. The airplane had been built too late for the war that created it. Accepted in May of 1945, 44-61748 entered service as the Second World War was moving toward its end. It did not build its reputation over Japan. Instead, like many late-production B-29s, it entered the uncertain post-war years, when thousands of aircraft were suddenly more numerous than the missions available for them. Then another war brought the Superfortress back. By 1952, 44-61748 was flying from Kadena on Okinawa with the 371st Bombardment Squadron of the 307th Bombardment Wing. The aircraft attacked targets across the Korean peninsula during a war that had returned the B-29 to combat. Later histories credit Hog Wild with around 105 combat missions. Whatever the exact count, the important point was simpler. This was not an empty airframe built for display. It had been an operational bomber in wartime service. That chapter eventually closed as well. After Korea, 44-61748 returned to the United States and passed into less glamorous work. It was used in a target towing and training role, one of the ways an aging bomber could remain useful after it was no longer wanted in frontline service. By November of 1956, it had arrived at China Lake, California. China Lake was a major weapons testing installation, not a museum storage facility. The dry desert environment could be kinder to metal than a wet coastal climate, but that did not make an aircraft airworthy. Hog Wild remained outside. Systems sat idle. Years passed without the regular inspection, servicing, and replacement that kept an active aircraft ready for flight. 23 years after arriving there, the B-29 was still at China Lake. By then, the Imperial War Museum in Britain was looking for a Superfortress for Duxford. A B-29 was an obvious aircraft for a collection devoted to 20th century air warfare, but acquiring one created a practical problem that began with its size. The Superfortress had a wingspan of more than 140 feet. It was a machine built around long-range flight, not easy road transport. Moving one from inland California to Britain as freight would mean disassembly, overland transport, ocean shipping, handling at both ends, and eventual reassembly. The alternative sounded almost backward. Instead of taking the airplane apart so it could become a museum exhibit, the project would return it to flying condition and send it to the museum under its own power. Participant accounts later described this as the cheaper alternative to dismantling and shipping the aircraft. Jack Kern and Aero Services of Tucson became central to that plan. Kern had experience with B-29s at China Lake, and the work on 44-61748 began with a limited objective. Nobody needed the aircraft to return to military service. Nobody was preparing it for years of commercial operation. The first goal was far narrower. Make it safe enough to leave China Lake. That still meant confronting a machine that had spent more than 2 decades standing still. Systems that had been idle for years now had to be inspected and made dependable enough for flight. A component that worked during a short ground test still had to prove that it could tolerate vibration, heat, and sustained operation once the aircraft was airborne. The team worked for 7 months. From a distance, the bomber could still look impressively complete. Its wings, engines, and massive fuselage were all there. But completeness and airworthiness are different things. A museum visitor judges whether an aircraft looks whole. A ferry crew has to know whether the systems inside that shape will continue working after the wheels leave the ground. For the team at China Lake, That meant treating the aircraft as a machine rather than as an artifact. The goal was not to erase every sign of age. It was to identify the problems that could stop a departure, correct what was necessary, and avoid turning the project into a restoration without an end date. Every hour of work was being measured against one practical question: what had to function for Hog Wild to reach Tucson safely? The restoration had to be selective. A museum could spend years improving the appearance of an aircraft, but a ferry project had a different set of priorities. Cosmetic completeness mattered far less than the parts needed to accelerate, climb, navigate, and stop. China Lake would provide the first test, and that test was simple. Could the bomber leave under its own power and reach Tucson without turning a preservation project into an emergency? The surviving photographic record shows that the work was not merely cosmetic. According to participant accounts and period photographs, the outer section of the left wing had to be replaced after corrosion and damage were found. That single task gave some sense of the gap between an aircraft that looked complete and one that was genuinely ready to fly. The 4 right radial engines presented their own uncertainty. A successful start showed that an engine could run. It did not prove that it could remain dependable for hours while producing the power needed to keep a heavy 4-engine bomber airborne. Eventually, the work reached the point where Hog Wild could move under its own power. Taxi tests and engine runs brought the project closer to its defining moment. Then came the attempts to leave. Even after the engines ran and the aircraft could taxi, the runway remained the dividing line between restoration and recovery. On the ground, a problem could end a test with the throttles closed and the airplane parked again. After takeoff, the crew would have to deal with whatever the aircraft revealed in flight. Imperial War Museum records state that it took 3 attempts before the B-29 finally departed China Lake. The surviving documentation does not clearly establish every individual problem that stopped the earlier tries, and there is no need to invent them. The important fact is that the first effort did not end with the bomber disappearing over the horizon. Neither did the second. Each delay returned the aircraft to the ground and the crew to more checks. That restraint mattered. 7 months of work did not make the aircraft safe simply because everyone wanted to see it fly. If something was wrong, there would be another inspection, another adjustment, another attempt. On the 16th of November 1979, the third attempt succeeded. 44 to 61748, accelerated along the runway at China Lake. 4 radial engines pulled the aircraft forward. The speed built. After 23 years at the desert station, the wheels finally left the ground. For a few seconds, the most important fact in the entire project was visible from outside. Hog Wild was flying again. It had not yet reached England. It had not even reached the next major workshop. But the state of the story had changed completely. Minutes earlier, the B-29 had still been a historic airframe whose future depended on whether it could leave China Lake at all. Now it was an aircraft in transit. The first destination was Tucson, Arizona. That flight was a victory, but it was not proof that Hog Wild was ready for the North Atlantic. A relatively short relocation from China Lake to Tucson demanded far less from the aircraft than the journey being planned for the following year. The first flight also changed the nature of the risk. At China Lake, every repair had been made with the aircraft sitting only a short distance from the people working on it. Once Hog Wild began moving from airport to airport, maintenance support would be separated by hundreds or thousands of miles. The aircraft could no longer rely on one fixed workshop. Each stop had to become both a destination and an inspection point. That made the route itself part of the recovery plan. Rather than attempt one dramatic leap toward Europe, the crew would move the bomber in stages, learning from each leg before committing to the next. A leak, an instrument fault, or an engine problem discovered on the ground could mean delay. The same problem discovered hours from land could mean something much more serious. At Aero Services, the standard changed. The question was no longer whether the B-29 could fly. The question was whether it could keep flying, leg after leg, across North America, into winter weather, over long stretches of water, and eventually into Britain. The route would take the aircraft east from Arizona to Flint, Michigan, then to Loring Air Force Base in Maine. From there, it would continue to Gander in Newfoundland, Sondestrom in Greenland, Keflavik in Iceland, RAF Mildenhall in England, and finally Duxford. The B-29 had the basic range for the planned route, but range on paper was only one part of the problem. A restored aircraft could still be limited by whatever system proved least reliable after hours of continuous operation. The journey therefore had to be treated as a chain of separate decisions. At the end of each leg, the condition of Hog Wild would determine whether the next one could begin. This was also where the project acquired an unusual human connection to the bomber's earlier era. One of the men who would help navigate Hog Wild across the North Atlantic was Henry J. Ramey Jr. He had been a B-29 navigator during the Second World War. More than 3 decades later, he was preparing to take the navigator's position in another Superfortress, this time on a journey whose destination was a museum. In mid-February of 1980, Hog Wild left Tucson and started east. One of the first major warnings came not from fuel, but from oil. According to Tig Ramey, whose family was directly involved in the ferry flight, and who later preserved detailed accounts of it, No. 3 engine used roughly 75 gallons of oil during the leg from Tucson to Flint. The engine's oil supply was only around 85 gallons. The numbers transformed the meaning of the route. A B-29 could carry enough fuel to remain airborne for many hours, but an engine could not safely run after losing the oil needed to lubricate and cool its moving parts. If oil consumption remained that high, the practical range of the aircraft was no longer determined by gasoline alone. It was also determined by oil. Hog Wild continued to Loring, but the trip paused there. Participant accounts describe almost a week spent dealing with oil leaks and related problems. A 4-engine bomber offered redundancy, but deliberately accepting an avoidable engine problem was not the point of the journey. The goal was not to demonstrate that Hog Wild could struggle onward after failures. It was to manage the aircraft conservatively enough that each weakness was dealt with before the next long overwater leg. The stop at Loring also showed why the ferry could not be treated as a simple endurance stunt. The aircraft had already done something remarkable by leaving China Lake, but that achievement did not excuse the crew from ordinary judgment. If a problem appeared, they stopped. If a system needed attention, the schedule waited. The success of the project depended less on forcing an old airplane onward than on refusing to confuse progress with proof of reliability. The pause at Loring showed exactly how the recovery was being conducted. The aircraft had exposed a limit, and the crew stopped to address it before that limit followed them out over the ocean. From Loring, the route continued toward Gander. Navigation now became another part of the challenge. Henry Ramey had spent his wartime career solving this kind of problem in the era when long-range flight demanded constant attention to position, heading, wind, and time. For the 1980 ferry, an inertial navigation system had been considered, but was not available. Participant accounts describe Ramey using dead reckoning, celestial navigation, an astro compass, and his A10A sextant, with modern calculating assistants helping with the arithmetic. Those accounts do not support the romantic idea that the crew crossed the Atlantic with a sextant alone, but they do show that celestial navigation and dead reckoning still mattered. A skill set associated with wartime B-29 operations had become useful again inside a B-29 more than 30 years later. Hog Wild reached Gander. Ahead lay Greenland. The flight from Gander toward Sondrestrom became the hardest part of the journey. During the leg, the temporary cabin heating system failed. The temperature inside the aircraft fell. Participant recollections describe frost forming on the inside of the windows as the crew continued north and east over the cold Atlantic. Hog Wild was not a fully restored combat aircraft with every original system returned to factory condition. The aim had always been more limited, to produce an aircraft capable of completing a ferry flight. Now one of the temporary solutions intended to make that flight bearable was no longer doing its job. The cold affected the crew directly. A long-range bomber has large internal spaces, and without effective heating, there was no warm passenger cabin to retreat into. The men still had to monitor engines, navigation, and instruments, while the temperature inside continued to fall. Frost on the inside of the windows was visible evidence of how severe the conditions had become. Then the instrument situation grew more complicated. Participant accounts describe moisture affecting the vacuum system and problems with some of the gyro instruments. Several important cockpit instruments in aircraft of this period depended on vacuum-driven gyroscopes. If those indications became unreliable, the pilot had to identify what information could still be trusted and fly with a reduced set of normal references. The Greenland leg therefore concentrated several different problems into the same few hours. The crew had an airplane that was mechanically old, a heating arrangement that had stopped helping, and a cockpit in which some normal instrument information could no longer be taken for granted. None of those facts by itself proves that disaster was imminent. Together, they explain why this portion of the ferry remained memorable to the people who experienced it. There is no need to turn the moment into a near crash that the evidence does not prove. The documented situation was difficult enough. The crew was in a recovered B-29, flying a winter North Atlantic leg with failed heating, frost inside the aircraft, and instrument problems developing while Greenland approached. Skip Kregier remained at the controls. Henry Ramey continued working the navigation. As they approached Greenland, accurate position and reliable instrument information became increasingly important. The crew continued toward Sondestrom using the systems and indications still available. Hog Wild reached the airfield. That landing did not end the journey, but it removed the hardest obstacle still standing between the aircraft and Britain. From Greenland, the B-29 continued to Keflavik in Iceland. Then it crossed another stretch of the North Atlantic and reached the United Kingdom. On the 1st of March 1980, Hog Wild arrived at RAF Mildenhall. The ocean crossing was over, but the delivery was not. Duxford was still ahead, and that final leg carried a different kind of weight. There was no reason to invent another crisis. The great mechanical questions had already been answered. The aircraft had left China Lake. It had crossed the United States. Its crews had managed oil problems, navigation demands, bitter cold, and unreliable instruments. It had reached Britain under its own power. Now it had to make one short final flight. On the 2nd of March, Hog Wild took off from Mildenhall and headed for Duxford. At the Imperial War Museum, people waited for a bomber that had been intended from the beginning to become a static exhibit. They were not watching crates arrive from a cargo ship. They were not looking at wings strapped to trucks or a fuselage waiting to be reassembled. They were watching a complete B-29 approach in the air. The landing was recorded on film. 44-61748. Descended toward Duxford, crossed the airfield boundary and touched down. The aircraft rolled out, taxied in front of the waiting crowd and came to a stop. Its engines were shut down. That was the end of its flying career. In the years that followed, the B-29 was restored further for display and eventually became part of the American Air Museum collection at Duxford. But its final journey gave this particular Superfortress another history. The Imperial War Museum had wanted an aircraft that could stand still. To get it there, a recovery team first had to undo 23 years of stillness. Jack Kern and the people working at China Lake spent 7 months preparing the bomber. 2 attempts to leave did not end with a departure. The third did. From Tucson, the standard became harder again. Hog Wild had to prove itself over longer flights. Oil consumption threatened to shorten its practical range. Maintenance at Loring kept it grounded again. An old B-29 navigator returned to celestial and dead reckoning techniques over the Atlantic. A temporary heater failed on the Greenland leg. Frost formed inside. Instrument problems complicated the approach. Still, the aircraft reached Greenland, Iceland, and Britain. On the 2nd of March, 1980, it reached the only destination that mattered. Duxford. The machine had been restored to flight, not so that it could keep flying, but so that it could stop forever in the right place. And on its tail, as it arrived in England, were 2 words: the end.